Britain declared war on Germany on August the 4th, 1914. In the first weeks of the conflict, German forces advanced quickly through France and Belgium, wiping out large sections of the British army. Defences at the front had become so threadbare that the British called in additional Indian troops to hold the line.
Within the first month, the British Expeditionary Force has taken huge casualties, horrific casualties. Where can they be reinforced from? Well, they can't be reinforced yet from the territorial force because it's not yet equipped and trained to take its place in the line. The only source of reinforcement is the other regular volunteer army run by the British, and that's the Indian Army.
2 divisions of infantry and cavalry of the Indian Army were mobilised, and in September 1914, soldiers began to arrive in Europe.
The original idea was that they'd have a couple of weeks to sort themselves out and train. There simply wasn't time. The First Battle of Ypres was raging. There were casualties amongst the British, there were holes in the line. Those lines had to be blocked.
The speedy arrival of Indian soldiers, known as sepoys, was crucial in the early stages of the war. In the first few months, they were flung into action as part of a desperate attempt to plug holes in the line, before they were assigned to a stretch of the front south of Ypres.
When the fighting of the First Battle of Ypres settles down and the Western Front effectively becomes siege warfare, and the Indian Corps are given their own sector as opposed to filling in gaps elsewhere, the British are holding about 38 to 40 miles of front, of which the Indians are holding about a third. So it's a very significant contribution.
Many of these soldiers were drawn from provinces which are now parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan and northwest India. Recruitment from these areas was heavily influenced by the idea of martial races.
The British martial theory was really very much a concept that certain races were much more warlike and had much more stamina on the battlefield than others.
Like the Sikhs and Gurkhas, Muslims had already fought on behalf of the British for decades and were highly regarded.
There were a number of Muslims of various types in the old Indian Army, but most of them came from the Punjab. And the Punjabi Mussulman, to give him his correct title, was regarded as being the backbone of the old British Indian Army and made up about a third of that army.
On the 30th of October 1914, the heroic actions of one Muslim sepoy, Khudadad Khan, earned him the Victoria Cross, the first ever to be awarded to an Indian soldier. Khan's grandson, Abdul Samad, never knew his grandfather, but the story of his exploits on the battlefield have filtered down through the generations.
वो गनर थे और जिस जर्मन्स ने इनके जो जितने साथी थे वो जर्मन्स शेलिंग से फौत हो गए थे और इनको भी शेल लगा था, लेकिन ये आखिरी वक्त तक इन्होंने मुकाबला करते रहे उनका जर्मन्स का और उनको रोके रखा ताकि वो ये ना समझे कि इधर सब डेड हो गए हैं और वो फारो मूव कर रहे हैं.
Winning honour on the battlefields of France and Belgium raised the standing of soldiers back in India. One fortunate soldier, Abdul Jabbar Khan, was granted leave and returned to a hero's welcome.
When I got out of the station, it was filled with people, and rockets were sent up, and a band accompanied me home. On the road, there was a scene just as if a general had arrived. I can hardly find time to write as the house is crowded with people wanting to hear about everything.
The Army's very British system of honours might have seemed far removed to men from such a different culture. But earning reputation through personal bravery was already familiar to Muslim troops as part of an ancient code of honour called Izzat. Izzat underpinned many aspects of Muslim life. Adherence to its principles, which had entered the wider Indian culture, was deeply embedded in the soldier's psyche.
Izzat meant that you did things that were right within your worldview, even if you knew that they were pointless and might get yourself killed. One example, of course, was wounded, that if you left anybody wounded in no man's land, you went out and you brought him back.
But they were also motivated by more basic needs. Many came from poor families dependent on their army wages. It was a relationship often referred to as tasting the salt.
If you had tasted the salt of Britain, what it literally meant was that you had tasted the fruits of being a soldier. You had enjoyed the benefits and prospered from them. So hence it was now time to prove your worth on the battlefield.
This loyalty to Britain was valued by the military hierarchy. In turn, British officers who led the Indian regiments immersed themselves in the cultures of India.
The British officer had to speak his language and had to speak it fluently. He had to understand his culture. He will eat the same food as the men. So if he was serving with Muslims, forget having bacon and egg for breakfast because they didn't eat pork. He will eat goat, chicken, rice, chapatis and dal.
4 years of combat took its toll.
By the end of the war, there had been approximately 8,500 Indian troops that had died. There had been 50,000 that had been wounded, and then more or less a third of these would have been Muslims.
But these great losses had not been in vain.
If the Indian army hadn't arrived when they did, the Germans might well have broken through. They might well have got to the Channel ports, and the whole history of the war might well have been very different. The Indian contribution was vital.